Welcome to Life Stories. What if everything you thought you knew about someone was a lie? What if the frail, elderly woman who walks into a dojo with a cane in hand is actually a living legend, capable of destroying anyone who dares challenge her? At first glance, Thelma White seems out of place, slow, unsure, and struggling to fit in. But what happens when the truth about her past finally comes to light? This isn't just about martial arts, it's about strength, redemption, and facing the ghosts of your past. Stay with us as we dive into Thelma's story, where every punch thrown uncovers more than just technique. It uncovers the battle for respect, identity, and the will to prove that age is no limit to reclaiming what's yours. Let's begin. The old wooden door of the Iron Dragon Martial Arts Academy creaked as it opened, and a figure stepped in, steadying herself with a cane. The light outside was fading, the last remnants of daylight casting long shadows across the academy's sleek floor. At 72, Thelma White had the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had learned to respect the fragility of time. Her floral cardigan hung loosely over her shoulders, and her cane tapped with each step. Her eyes, however, were sharp, alive with observation, not the frailty of old age. Yet none of the young faces around her would notice. The teenagers were too busy whispering, exchanging glances. Tyler, the dojo's self-proclaimed alpha, stifled a snicker behind his hand. Josh, his loyal sidekick, barely contained a loud laugh. The elderly woman was clearly out of place. Thelma didn't mind. She had learned long ago to ignore the judgment of others. "I'd like to observe a class," she said softly to the receptionist, her voice steady but carrying a subtle power. The young woman behind the counter blinked in surprise, a look of incredulity flashing across her face. Sure," the receptionist said, trying to mask her disbelief. "You want to join the karate class?" "Yes, I'd like to," Thelma replied with a kind smile, lowering herself onto a nearby bench. As she waited, her eyes swept over the class in progress. Young bodies moved with precision, executing punches, kicks, and fluid kata. The instructor, Sensei Rick, barked commands, his voice like a whip cracking through the room. He was the picture of the modern martial artist, focused, muscular, and in complete control. His eyes scanned the class critically. Thelma's gaze never wavered as she took in every movement, every shift in posture, the energy of the room. She was calculating, watching them all with an unspoken understanding. But none of them saw her. Not yet. After the class ended, Thelma slowly stood and approached the training floor, her cane now leaning against the wall. Rick was wiping sweat from his brow when he noticed her standing there. His professional smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I hope so," she said, her smile unwavering. "I'm interested in joining your beginner's class." Rick's smile faltered. "Ma'am, our program is physically demanding. I'm not sure it would be appropriate for someone of your age." Thelma's smile didn't change. "I understand, but I've been thinking karate could offer me more than just physical fitness. It could offer me the discipline I need." There was a pause. Rick glanced at the receptionist, Amanda, who exchanged an uncomfortable glance with him. "We have insurance concerns," Rick said, his voice trailing off. "But I suppose we can let you try. It's not a problem for a trial period, at least." Thelma nodded gracefully. "Thank you." The class on Monday was smaller than the one she had observed. Thelma, now dressed in the oversized white GI, stood at the back of the room, feeling the eyes on her. The young students snickered as she adjusted her belt, which hung awkwardly around her waist. "Let's start with basic stances," Rick announced to the class. Thelma watched carefully as Rick demonstrated the front stance, the fluidity and power in his movements. She tried to mimic him, bending her knees as he had. Her knees protested, the joints stiff with age, but she gritted her teeth and pressed on. Her movements were awkward, uncertain. Her balance faltered, and she had to steady herself with her cane. "No canes on the floor," Rick called out, his tone cold. "If you need that, maybe this isn't for you." Thelma nodded, setting her cane aside. She wobbled back into position, her movements slower now, but still steady. The other students laughed quietly, but Thelma's face remained calm, her eyes focused. As the class moved on to punches and blocks, Thelma struggled. Her timing was off, her body failing to move with the fluidity it once had. The students, most of them in their late teens and early 20s, exchanged glances, mocking her under their breath. At the end of class, Thelma bowed deeply, despite the humiliation she had endured. "Thank you, Sensei," she said softly. "I look forward to improving." Rick looked at her, taken aback by the formality and grace in her words, despite the awkwardness of her performance. "Sure," he said with a half-hearted nod. "See you Wednesday." Later in the locker room, Thelma overheard Tyler and Josh's laughter through the thin walls. "Did you see her trying to do the horse dance?" Tyler mocked loudly. "Like a newborn giraffe." Josh joined in, his voice high-pitched. "Thank you, Sensei," he mimicked, making fun of Thelma's bow. Mia, a young woman who had been silently watching, stepped forward. "Come on, guys, that's enough," she said firmly, but not without hesitation. Tyler shot her a look. "What, defending Grandma now?" he sneered. Mia just shook her head. "Whatever, I'm out." Thelma, overhearing the conversation, simply sighed. She had been through worse in her life. She knew that their mockery meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. But deep inside, a part of her longed for something more. Recognition, respect, perhaps even redemption. As she left the dojo that day, she didn't look back. But inside, she was fighting a battle far more significant than any physical contest. It was the fight against the memory of who she had once been and the desire to reclaim that strength. At home that evening, Thelma opened an old, weathered box from the top shelf of her closet. Inside was a black belt, frayed with age, and a photograph of a younger Thelma standing tall among a group of martial artists in Japan. The photograph was from a time long past, a time when she was known as Thunderfist White. Her fingers traced the image, a sharp ache in her chest. The life she had left behind was still there, buried beneath the years, but it had never really left her. What would it take to reclaim the woman she once was? Is it worth it to go back and face the ghosts of her past, or should she let it all fade away? As Thelma tied the black belt around her waist once again, she knew that the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The next class would be different. Thelma was ready to face not just the dojo's mockery, but her own ghosts, too. Thelma entered the dojo the next day with a quiet confidence that was not entirely her own. The day before had left a mark on her, but she wore it like armor. As she walked through the door, the students immediately noticed the difference. The usual murmurs and laughter seemed to quiet, replaced by a charged tension that hummed in the air. Thelma wasn't the frail old woman they had dismissed. She wasn't even just the confused beginner who had stumbled through basic stances. She was something more, something they hadn't yet realized. Tyler and Josh didn't know what to make of her. The previous day, they had tried to play their usual tricks, mocking her slow movements and exaggerated posture. But today was different. There was no cane. There was no fumbling. Thelma stood tall, her back straight, her eyes sharp. She walked to the back of the room and set her things down, deliberately placing her GI bag beside the wall. Her movements were slower, yes, her age still evident, but there was a quiet authority to the way she moved, a subtle strength in her composure. Rick, for the first time since she had joined the dojo, looked at her with something other than impatience. His eyes were calculating, sizing her up as he did with every student. He had dismissed her before. But now, the weight of her presence couldn't be ignored. His eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long before he turned back to the class, clearing his throat. "All right, today we're going to focus on footwork and basic sparring. Pair up and get ready," he instructed, his voice not quite as commanding as usual. Thelma didn't need to be told twice. She moved toward the center of the floor where a few students had already begun stretching. Her body ached, yes, but it was a familiar pain. The kind of pain that reminded her she was still alive, still capable. She wasn't the woman who had left the sport 20 years ago. She wasn't even the woman who had stepped into this dojo only a few days earlier. She was the Thunderfist again, but this time she wasn't fighting for a title. She was fighting for herself. Rick paired her with Josh. He could barely conceal the smirk on his face as he stepped forward, eager to show the old woman just how out of her depth she was. He had heard the rumors, her past, her legacy, but he was young, strong, and confident. What did she have? Her age? Her cane? He didn't care. He was going to show her just how far out of her league she was. They squared off on the mat, both bowing to one another. Thelma's bow was deep and respectful, but Josh couldn't hide the arrogance in his stance. He was ready to prove something. He was ready to humiliate her, to show everyone that he was the one who deserved the attention. "Let's keep it light," Rick called out. "No heavy hits, just technique." Josh lunged forward, throwing a quick jab aimed at Thelma's face. She moved without thinking, just like the reflexes of years past, her body swaying to the side with a fluidity that caught Josh off guard. He missed by a hair, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she had avoided his punch, a simple movement, and he couldn't land it. He came at her again, this time with a kick. Thelma's footwork shifted seamlessly, evading the strike by mere inches. She was slower than him, yes, but she had something he lacked: awareness. She had been here before, in battles far more dangerous than this sparring match. Josh tried again, but this time, he wasn't just testing her. He was getting frustrated. Each time he attacked, she deflected. Each time he tried to overwhelm her with speed and strength, she absorbed the hit and neutralized it with precision. His attacks grew more aggressive. His moves became reckless. He wanted to show everyone, especially her, that he could win. But with every strike that missed, Thelma's control over the fight grew. She wasn't forcing anything. She was simply letting it unfold. Finally, in one swift movement, Thelma stepped inside his guard, just as he went for another punch. Her hand moved to his chest, not a strike, but a touch. A single palm placed gently against his ribcage. The gesture was almost too soft, too subtle, but it froze Josh in his tracks. For the first time, he saw what he had been too blind to notice. This old woman, had the power to end him with a single touch. Not with force, but with understanding, with control. Josh stood there, his breath coming in quick gasps, his chest heaving beneath her hand. For a moment, the dojo fell silent. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. The others had been watching, waiting, and now they saw it too. The way Thelma had turned the match without breaking a sweat. Rick, still on the sidelines, watched with growing unease. His jaw tightened. He had been expecting a show, a quick win for Josh. But this was something else entirely. The old woman hadn't just avoided a few punches. She had shown him and the entire dojo that there was more to martial arts than raw strength. There was something deeper. Something that couldn't be learned from brute force alone. Josh, humiliated and breathing heavily, stepped back. His eyes met Thelma's, searching for something, maybe an apology, maybe some kind of excuse. But there was none. She stood tall, her expression calm, unbothered. She had won without ever raising a fist, and in that moment, he knew. He knew she had beaten him, not physically, but mentally. She had taught him more in a few minutes than he had learned in years of training. As the class continued, Thelma moved back to the wall, her posture still straight, her eyes scanning the room. But something was different. The others who had once laughed, who had once mocked her, were now watching her with new eyes. Mia, who had been silent until now, caught her gaze from across the room. There was a look of awe in her eyes, a silent recognition of the power that Thelma had hidden so well. And then, just as the class was winding down, Rick pulled her aside. "You could have ended him," he said quietly, his voice strained. Thelma looked at him, her face unreadable. "I didn't need to." Rick's face softened, the realization dawning. He had been wrong about her, about everything. She wasn't just a former champion who had faded into obscurity. She was a legend, and maybe, just maybe, she was about to change everything. What would happen if Thelma decided to teach these young fighters her secrets? How much could they truly learn from her? And what would it cost them to understand it? Rick looked at Thelma one last time, his respect for her now undeniable. The true fight, he realized, had just begun. The dojo was filled with a strange kind of stillness. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room, but the kind of silence that follows a powerful revelation. Thelma stood in the center of the mat, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on her. It wasn't just respect she felt now. It was something deeper. something that hadn't existed here before. She had lived her life in the shadows for so long, hiding her true strength, her true identity. But now, the truth was out, and there was no turning back. Tyler stood at the edge of the dojo, watching her closely. The mocking grin had long since faded from his face, replaced by a complex mix of respect and confusion. The others weren't laughing now. They had seen what she was capable of. They had witnessed her power, not through brute force, but through control, discipline, and the quiet strength of experience. Thelma had shown them what real mastery looked like, and for the first time, they understood that there was more to martial arts than just flashy moves and competition. It was about the internal battle, the struggle to remain calm and centered when everything around you is in chaos. Rick stood nearby, his face unreadable. He had never expected this. He had trained students for years, pushing them to their limits, but he had never faced someone like Thelma. She was a force of nature, a woman who had lived through pain, loss, and triumph, and had come out the other side with a quiet dignity that was impossible to ignore. She had been fighting battles for decades that Rick couldn't even begin to understand, and yet here she was, teaching him lessons he had never thought to learn. He felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her, and yet there was also a pang of regret. Had he failed her by dismissing her at the beginning? Had he allowed his ego to blind him to the truth? "Sensei, are you ready?" Josh's voice broke through the silence, his tone cautious. Thelma looked up and saw him standing by the edge of the mat, waiting for her to make the first move. The once cocky young man had changed. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the way he was looking at her now. It wasn't mockery in his eyes anymore. It was something far more meaningful. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, but her heart was beating faster than she had expected. She hadn't planned on this moment. She hadn't planned on this confrontation. But sometimes life didn't give you a choice. Sometimes you had to face your demons, even when they were hidden behind the faces of the people you had come to know and care about. Rick stepped forward, a faint frown on his face. "Remember, Josh," he said, his voice measured. "This is light sparring. No one is here to prove anything." But there was something different in the way he said it. It was as if he was speaking to Josh and himself, as if he, too, had realized that this wasn't just a sparring match. It was a moment of reckoning. Josh nodded, but Thelma could see the nervousness in his eyes. He had been humbled, but there was still a fire in him, a desire to prove something, to show that he wasn't intimidated. She respected that. She respected his willingness to learn. But she also knew that this was her final lesson to him. The last step in his journey to truly understand what martial arts was about. It wasn't about defeating your opponent. It wasn't about winning. It was about balance, control, and knowing when to strike and when to let go. As they squared off, Thelma moved with a fluidity that surprised even her. The age in her body was still there, but the fire in her heart burned as bright as ever. She had spent decades perfecting her craft, and now, in this moment, everything fell into place. Josh came at her faster than before, but his movements were no longer just attacks. They were tests. He was searching for something in her, something that could help him. He wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to understand. Thelma blocked his first punch easily, redirecting the force with a subtle shift in her weight. She didn't need to move fast. She didn't need to overpower him. She just needed to be in the right place at the right time. Josh's attacks grew more frantic, more aggressive, but she remained calm. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was testing her patience, testing her resolve. She stepped inside his guard, just as she had done before. This time, her hand didn't touch his chest. It pressed lightly against his throat, a mere inch away from where it could have ended the match. The gesture wasn't a strike, it was a reminder that she could have taken him down in an instant. But she didn't. Because that's not what this was about. This wasn't about winning. This was about showing him how to control his own power, how to choose when to strike and when to step back. Josh froze, his breath catching in his throat, his entire body tensed, but it wasn't fear he felt. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. For the first time, he understood. He understood what Thelma had been trying to teach him all along. The true strength wasn't in the strike. It wasn't in the victory. It was in the control, in the discipline to know when to hold back. Thelma stepped back and bowed deeply, acknowledging him not just as a student but as a fellow martial artist. Josh bowed in return, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Rick, who had been silently watching, nodded to himself. He finally understood. Thelma wasn't just a legend, she was a teacher, a true master. The room was silent as Thelma gathered her things. She didn't need to say anything. She had already spoken through her actions. She had shown them all the lessons they needed to learn. As she walked to the door, she felt the weight of the years lift off her shoulders. She had come back for herself, not for recognition, not for applause. But in the end, she had received something far greater: respect. And in that, she had found her peace. How many of us go through life pretending to be something we're not, hiding the truth of who we are until we can no longer ignore it? Can we ever truly reclaim what we've lost, or is it too late by the time we finally see what we've become? The students of Iron Dragon would never be the same again, and neither would Thelma. For the first time in years, she could finally let go of the past and embrace the future that was waiting for her, one step at a time.